All right, let's jump right in. We are about to go on an incredible journey. It's a story that starts with you, with your family, but then it zooms out to connect every single living thing on this planet. This is the story of heredity and evolution. Really, it's the story of where we all come from.
And it all kicks off with a super simple question, one I bet you've asked yourself before. You look in the mirror and you see your mom's eyes or maybe your dad's smile, but you're not a carbon copy of either of them, are you? That mix of being so similar, yet so different, that little puzzle is exactly what we're going to unpack today. And you know what? The clues are hiding in plain sight. I mean, check this out. Some of us have earlobes that hang down, and others have earlobes that connect right to the side of their head. It seems like such a tiny, insignificant thing, right? But that is an inherited trait. And it's these subtle little variations that are the raw materials for this entire epic story. These little variations from your earlobes to your eye color are called traits. And for centuries, how they got passed down was a total mystery. It all seemed completely random. But here's the thing, it wasn't. And the person who first cracked the code wasn't some famous scientist in a high-tech lab. Nope. He was a quiet monk just patiently working in his garden. And that brings us to the first part of our story, understanding the basic rules of the game. Thanks to Mendel. He's the one who started it all, the one who first began to crack the code of life. And here he is, Gregor Mendel. He was an Austrian monk, sure, but he was also a brilliant scientific mind with a totally unique idea. He brought math into biology. He didn't just look at his pea plants, he counted them, meticulously. And by simply counting and keeping records, he discovered patterns that had been hiding right under everyone's noses for centuries. His most famous experiments began with something really straightforward. He took pea plants that he knew were always tall, and he crossed them with plants that were always short. So what do you think you'd get? A bunch of medium-sized plants, maybe? A mix? Well, the reality was so much stranger and way more interesting. Get this, the result of that first cross was wild. Every single one of the new plants was tall. The short trait had just vanished. Poof, gone. But Mendel, being a good scientist, didn't stop there. He let those new tall plants reproduce with each other. And in the next generation, boom, the short trait came back like it was there all along. About 1 in every 4 plants was short. So what in the world was going on? This was Mendel's genius insight. Traits don't just blend together like paint. Some traits can actually hide or mask other traits. He called the one that always showed up, like tallness, dominant, and he called the one that could hide, like shortness, recessive. The short trait was never really gone in that first generation. It was just being overshadowed by the dominant tall trait. Now, Mendel called these things factors. He had no idea what they were physically made of. Today, we know that these instructions are called genes, and genes are just sections of that amazing molecule, DNA. The best way to think of it is that your DNA is the entire massive instruction manual for building an organism. A single gene is just one sentence in that manual, one specific instruction, like make the plant tall. Okay, so now we've got the rules of inheritance, but this is where the story gets so much bigger, because these rules don't just make perfect copies, they create variation. And variation is the fuel, it's the engine that drives all the change in the history of life. Let's break that down. Some organisms, like bacteria, just make clones of themselves. It's efficient, but it creates very little new variation. But sexual reproduction, well, that's like taking the genetic decks of cards from 2 different parents and shuffling them together for every single child. It creates this massive, incredible amount of diversity, and that is the essential fuel that allows life to adapt and evolve. So we have traits and we have variation. But how does that lead to the mind-boggling biodiversity we see all over the planet? To get a handle on that, we're going to zoom in and tell a little story about a population of beetles. Imagine you've got a bunch of red beetles living on some green leaves. They're pretty easy for crows to spot and, well, you know. But then, thanks to random variation, one of the beetles is born green. The crows just can't see this one as easily against the leaves, so it survives longer, has more babies, and passes on its green genes. Over time, the green beetles start to become more common. That's not random luck. That trait gave it a real survival advantage, and that is natural selection. Okay, now for a different scenario. This time, a blue beetle is born. Its color doesn't give it any advantage at all. But one day, an elephant just happens to wander by and accidentally steps on a bunch of the red beetles. Just by pure dumb luck, the blue ones happen to survive. Now the population is mostly blue. That's called genetic drift. It's when a population changes because of random chance, not because of a survival advantage. But here is a super important difference. What if, say, there's a famine and all the beetles are malnourished, so they end up smaller? Well, that's a change that happened to them during their lifetime. It's an acquired trait. It doesn't change their DNA, so it's not going to be passed on to their babies. And that's the key. Evolution only works on the traits that are inherited. So now imagine these two powerful forces, natural selection and genetic drift, acting on a population not for a few years, but for millions of years. Then you add in something like a new river that splits the population in two. Over time, the two groups change so much that they can't reproduce with each other anymore. At that point, you don't just have different-looking beetles. You have entirely new species. That's how speciation happens. So that's the big idea. It's an amazing story. But how do we know it's true? Well, the evidence is all around us. It's written in the bodies of living creatures, and it's buried in the rocks right beneath our feet. We're going to learn how to read the story of life. Just take a look at the bones in the forelimb of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. They're used for totally different jobs, right? Grasping, walking, swimming, flying. And yet, if you look at the underlying structure, they're all built from the same basic parts. This is what's called a homologous structure, and it's powerful evidence that we all inherited that basic bone plan from a distant shared ancestor. And of course, we also have a timeline that's literally written in stone. Fossils. They're preserved traces of ancient life, and they give us a direct window into the past. They show us not just individual species, but entire worlds that have come and gone. They let us trace the family trees of life back through millions upon millions of years. Now for some evidence that's a little closer to home. In fact, it might be in your refrigerator right now. What on earth do broccoli, kale, cauliflower, and cabbage all have in common? They look totally different from each other. Would you believe it if I told you that all of these veggies are actually the exact same species? They've just been modified over generations by human beings. We've been directing their evolution ourselves. It's true. They all started out as a single plant, the wild cabbage. But for thousands of years, farmers acted as the force of selection. They'd say, hey, I like the plants with the biggest leaves, and they'd save those seeds. Generations later, you get kale. They'd select for the plants with dense, tightly packed flowers, and eventually, you get broccoli and cauliflower. This is evolution by selection, and it's happening right in our farms and gardens. And this all brings us to a final, really crucial point. There's this common idea that evolution is like a ladder of progress, with humans sitting right at the top. But that's just not how it works. Evolution is a vast branching tree. There's no better or higher. There's only diversity. A bacterium living in a hot spring is just as successful and just as evolved as we are. It's just on a completely different branch of the tree. So, we started with a simple question about why you look like your parents, and that question took us through the entire story of life on Earth. And that leaves us with one last, really fascinating thought. Evolution didn't stop millions of years ago. It's happening right now, all around us. Which really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What changes are taking root today that will end up shaping the tree of life tomorrow?